Okay, so what's with all the space aliens? Well, at least that's what they look like. These are neurons, and the average brain, human brain that is, has 100 billion of these. And each neuron has, on average, about 7,000 connections each, which adds up to trillions of connections. So the picture doesn't really do it justice. But the way these neurons interact with each other and the way they can change over time, depending on what you're trying to learn and what you're doing in a repetitive way, say for instance, is known as neuroplasticity. So how does that affect us as bass players? That's the important thing. So I'll come back to neurons and how they work in just a minute, but my main focus really, again concentrating on bass playing, is top 10 practice tips that will involve neuroplasticity and help you to learn things and grow as a bass player more quickly. So number one, we'll look at you, goals, motivation, that sort of thing. Number two, we'll look at focus. Number three, memory, different kinds of memory. Number four, deliberate practice and desirable difficulty. Number five, interleave practice. Number six, space learning. Number seven, sleep, which affects everything. Number eight, retrieval and retrieval practice, remembering in fact. Number nine, visualization, either with or without the bass. And number 10, when and where is a good time or a good place to practice. So coming back to our neurons, the first thing you'll probably notice is they're almost tree-like in their structure. By that I mean, if you look at the head of the neuron or the nucleus or soma, it's very much like a branch-like structure, and these branches are known as dendrites. Now these dendrites will connect with the next neuron through at the other end of the tree, or the neuron as it were, through axon terminals. And now the axon itself is the part that connects the two ends of the neuron. And what happens when you're trying to learn something new is an electrical signal will be sent from one end of the neuron to the other one along the axon. And that electrical signal will change into a chemical signal when it reaches the end of the axon terminal and meets the dendrites of the following neuron. And at that point you find a lot of what these are, and these are synapses. And this is where the electrical signal or the action potential is converted into a chemical signal. So what's happening when you learn something new is a three-stage process really. Number one, the more you try to learn something, the more you'll have dendritic spines and dendritic growth, trying to find more connections, very much like the branches that have buds on them, trying to connect with the roots of the following neuron. So number one, dendritic growth. Number two, synaptic plasticity. So the synapse itself, the more you learn and the more you repeat, say a motor action when you're playing, will change the synapse in that it'll become larger, but more importantly, it'll start growing more receptors to pick up more of the incoming chemicals or the signaling chemicals that will send their signals from one synapse to the next. The third part of the process is known as myelination. So the axon itself will start to build up a fatty covering known as myelin. It's basically insulating the axon and the electrical signal that travels from one end to the other. It's a bit like duct tape for the brain, in fact. So it'll allow the electrical signal to travel much more quickly. And you've probably noticed when you try to learn something, your fingers are quite slow in doing whatever they're doing. But as time goes past and with repetition and really focusing on the action that you're making, the motor patterns will become a lot more faster. So that's what's going on. Number one, your synapses are becoming more efficient, and this process is known as long-term potentiation, or LTP. So synapses grow in size, and they end up with more receptors, so more chemical signals can get through, and you'll also end up with myelination of the axons, so that the electrical signal can travel much more quickly. So think of it like a pathway through the snow, and as you're treading the pathway to and fro, say from your house to somebody else's house, that pathway will get wider and wider, and it'll allow faster signals to get from one place to the next. So that's your basic structure for neurons and neuroplasticity. So how does this affect our top 10 practice tips? Well, first of all, obviously all this starts with you, and finding a purpose in your bass playing is really quite helpful in just having some kind of end picture of yourself and where you want to get to, because in knowing that will set yourself up for a lot of what's going to follow. So it could be anything from either wanting to make a living in the professional music world, or learning a different style of music or different technique, creating your own music, your own bass lines, whatever it might be. It's a very personal thing, and the more stronger your vision or your purpose is, the more likely you are to have goals that will allow you to reach that. So the goal itself can be a large goal, but any large goal can be broken down into smaller goals or smaller steps. So the goals will obviously help you climb that mountain, whatever it is that you want to get to, in finding your purpose. And that in itself will provide you with motivation, and the more positive you are and the more motivated you are about whatever it is that you're trying to learn or whatever technique you're trying to perfect, that's really going to affect neuroplasticity. The more motivated you are and the more positive you are about your learning, the more likely your brain is to start producing dopamine, and dopamine in itself will really speed up the learning process because it will help with long-term potentiation and synaptic plasticity. So number one is definitely you there. Excuse me. Which leads me to number two, focus. There are different ways of really getting into a very strong and very laser-like focus. One of the most important things you can do is just be relaxed to a certain point. Having said that, there is also a theory that says that with a bit of agitation, you're more likely to get neuroplasticity working for you. And this is what all this is about. It's getting your own biology to work for you more effectively. So having a little bit of although you're relaxed, having a bit of urgency in the back of your mind, almost like fooling yourself into thinking, okay, well, I've got an exam or an audition coming up at the end of the week, I really need to focus on this, and that will actually promote neuroplasticity and help to make these connections more strong and more effective. However, having said that, being relaxed and focused, again, you can get yourself into that state by thinking about just breathing, and posture as well. You've probably heard of the Alexander technique, and there's been a lot of work on posture, and just showing that even just straightening up your posture will increase your level of breathing and increase your output by sometimes up to 20%. So being aware of your posture and aware of your breathing and being relaxed, very important, because that in itself will lead the brain into an alpha state. Now there's various different states of the brain. The average brain during the average day is usually in a beta state, so a bit more sort of hyper, as it were, whereas the alpha state is more relaxed and more focused, but it's certainly more adaptive when it comes to neuroplasticity and learning. The other thing you need to help focus, obviously, is avoid distractions, turning off your phone, that kind of thing, unless you're using it to play along with it, music, that kind of thing. And a very important part of focus is just having a growth mindset. Now, the growth mindset was developed by a neuroscientist, Carol Dweck, and it really focuses on the learning itself as opposed to the end goal of learning. So really being positive about just doing hard work and getting into the learning state itself, and being positive about that will more than likely spark off neuroplasticity and get your learning to be more effective for you. So being positive and being motivated are everything when it comes to learning something new. Memory, number 3. There are several different kinds of memory, obviously, but they're all in different parts of the brain. So visual memory tends to be something like 50%, I think, of the neocortex. Auditory memory, obviously, is very important to us as musicians. Kinesthetic memory, the sensation of touch, pressure, movement. Analytical memory, not so important, but it's one to bear in mind. So that's the nuts and bolts of music, intervals, scales, chords, that kind of thing. And emotional memory, how a piece of music might affect you emotionally and how it makes you feel, which will also come back to motivation. Now, this is not to get confused with learning types. There is a bit of a myth involving all this stuff. The big mistake they made with learning types was, say, if you consider yourself to be a visual learner, then concentrating on learning things visually. And that's where they made the big mistake, because it's not about learning something that's your strongest modality, say, as a visual learner. If you are that way inclined, the most important thing you can do is concentrate on the other memories. So your auditory or your kinesthetic memory, focus on them. That's the most important thing you can do when it comes to memory. So when you're coming to something new, always think about, okay, how can I learn this visually? What does it sound like? How can I learn it auditorily, kinesthetically, and analytically, and obviously emotionally? So, for instance, if you're trying to learn the notes on the neck or something like that, one way forward is to write them down. Another way forward is to say the note names as you're writing them, and sing them as well, and play them. So write it, say it, sing it, play it. Because then you're starting to combine different areas of the brain and make stronger connections between those areas. So all of these different types of memory are going to help you if you start linking them up. And the stronger they're linked together, the more positive and more quickly retrieved these memories are going to be. So, number 4, deliberate practice. You may or may not have heard about this before, but again, it's a way of focusing on whatever's giving you the most problems when you're running through new pieces or old pieces, and focusing on the parts that you are finding more difficult or are creating mistakes. Now, mistakes in themselves are not a bad thing. In fact, if you push your playing, say, speed-wise or technically wise, and start making mistakes, the mistakes themselves will start to generate neuroplasticity. At that point, you need to think about fixing the mistakes. So the way forward there is, say, if you're playing through a piece and you find yourself making a mistake in a certain part, put a frame around it, remove it from the context of what you're playing, and concentrate on fixing just that part, or the hardest part, or the part that's causing you difficulties. Slow it down, consider the fingering, perhaps playing it in a different area of the neck, really concentrating on what's giving you the difficulty and causing the mistake, what's the root of the mistake, and figuring that out, fixing the mistake, and then putting it back in. So playing something from the beginning all the way up to the mistake, fixing the mistake, then going back to the beginning is not the best way to do things. Really what you want to do is just focus on the area of the mistake and then put it back into context, only using a bar on either side, say, for instance. So desirable difficulty, again, is finding a level of difficulty within your playing. So if it's too easy, you're not really going to spark off neuroplasticity, and if it's too difficult, then that's going to start affecting your motivation. So again, it needs to be this balance that can create a flow state or positivity that again is going to help you spark off neuroplasticity and really get the brain working for you, your own biology working for you in effect. So the way you practice is really all about quality rather than quantity. And again, if you're very specific on those particular things and very careful about going back over mistakes and fixing them very thoroughly, that's when deliberate practice really comes into its own. So number 5, interleave practice. It's been discovered that the block practice, saying repeating things over and over and over again, is a really bad idea, and it's not going to get this stuff working for you. So 3 to 5 minutes on whatever it might be, on scales, arpeggios, working on different bass lines, different songs, either reading music or improvising. Chop and change, mix it up, 10 minutes max, and then go on to something completely different. And the more different it is and the more you can mix things up, the better. This will really start to get your neurons firing in different ways, and will still start to get neuroplasticity working for you. So another way to look at this is, if you're learning something new, is just learning small parts of it. Again, this is known as chunking. So 3 to 4 bars at a time, maybe even less if it's a really complex piece. So break it up into small parts and come back to it the next day. Or better still, number 6, in space practicing, you don't come back to it the next day, you come back to it after a couple of days. And what this allows the brain to do is to start making these connections while you sleep or while you're resting, because these connections won't happen while you're actually in the process of learning something. All this starts to happen when you're sleeping or when you're resting later on. So the space learning is quite important for this. And basically, as you learn something, you'll tend to forget it quite quickly. It's known as the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. So by coming back a day, revisiting something, then maybe a couple of days later on, and then after a week again, that forgetting curve will start to flatten out as you're revising things and replaying them and practicing recalling things to your memory. So number 7, sleep is the one important thing in all of this, because this is when all the magic happens. So getting a good night's sleep and try and avoid your mobile phone like an hour before you get to sleep is really going to help all this start to work for you, because that's when all the magic of neuroplasticity happens, when you're sleeping. Retrieval, again, it's very important to practice just retrieving things when you've learnt them, and also retrieving things say from several weeks ago or from an old practice session. So you get into the habit of bringing up old things from the memory that you might not normally do, and just the habit of retrieving things, reviewing, revising, revisiting will help you to concentrate, and will in fact make the whole retrieval process a lot more efficient. Finally, number 9, visualization. So this is also known as mental practice. You can do this either with or without the bass. Obviously, without the bass, wherever you might be, if you go through the mental rehearsal or mental practice within your mind, just seeing your hands playing a piece and really think about the sound and what your fingers are doing when you're playing it. This will actually make neuroplasticity start to happen, and there's been quite a bit of scientific research into that, and it does actually work. And you can also use this when you're playing. For instance, coming back to our deliberate practice, if you find yourself making mistakes in a certain passage, stop playing and really visualize the piece, hear it perfectly, see your hands working perfectly, and then replay it. And if it doesn't quite work, then go through the process again. So in stopping and starting and using visualization, you're actually helping all this neuroplasticity and wiring up the brain to your own advantage. Finally, when and where to practice. Now, when is quite an interesting thing. You've probably heard of circadian rhythms, which is the whole day. The whole 24-hour clock can be broken up into smaller sections, and these are known as ultradian rhythms. Now, they tend to go in 90-minute cycles. So you'll have 90 minutes where you reach a peak of energy, and then that'll drop down into a sort of 20-minute trough of lack of energy. And this goes through sleeping and waking. So you'll probably find, and this is where it becomes quite personal as to when, you'll probably find certain parts of the day where you just have a bit more energy. So try and make a mental note of those times, and if you can focus on playing at those times, work permitting, depending on what you're doing, then fine. You might find that at certain times later on in the evening might work better for you. So again, it's quite a personal thing, just finding the best time of the day for you. So it's one to be experimented with, and again, take notes of when you feel more energetic during the day, and you'll find that that'll be the best time to approach practicing. Where is an interesting one, and this was news to me, quite interesting, because this news to me quite recently. The theory used to be always practice in the same spot, have everything set up, ready to go. Apparently, if you are learning new things, it actually helps to vary that. So practice somewhere else in the house. Just find a different area, and this can actually again spark off neuroplasticity just through the sheer novelty factor of practicing in the kitchen as opposed to practicing in your studio or the front room or wherever you might be practicing. So there we go. There's the top 10 practice tips with neuroplasticity in mind, and I'll be looking at these in a bit more detail in the future, but in the meantime, I hope that's been of value to you, and enjoy practicing. That's the most important thing. Thanks again.